How many are new? As in, like, you weren't at the morning session, you're here just for the evening session? Can I have a look? Show of hands. Ooh, okay, quite a number, half of you. Okay, so he scared half of the crowd away and then got another crowd giving him. So, thanks for being here, and we hope that for those of you in the morning, you enjoyed the session. It was on the prayers of St. Francis, because the way to get to St. Francis's soul is through his prayers. But no point having the God experience in our heart without actually going out in mission. And so today, this evening session will be on mission. Tomorrow morning will be on the Holy Spirit, but as reflected and meditated by St. Bonaventure, who is a Franciscan theologian and doctor of the Church. And then tomorrow evening here will be on the sacraments, right? And so you can see it's quite complete there, and in liturgy and worship. So this evening, Wayne will be talking about St. Francis and Pope Francis on the 3 encyclicals. So just for the sake of those who were not here in the morning, very briefly who Wayne is. For some of you who are familiar with Franciscanism, you know that we rely on the writings of St. Francis or writings about St. Francis, his life, like people like Celano who wrote, St. Bonaventure who wrote. And so there are 3 volumes of these works about this thick. So there are 3 friars, one from OFM, my branch. You'll find that how come he's wearing grey, and how come his bib is a little bit bigger than ours. And then you know about Padre Pio, who is a Capuchin. So Maximilian Kolbe is Conventual, Friar. So we have 3 branches of the first order. So every branch had one chap in this team to do the translation. And Wayne is the one who is representing the Conventuals. So the 3 of them worked over years to produce all these writings and translated from the Latin into English. After that, they followed on with commentary and helping us to understand the text. So keep producing. So Wayne, this time round coming to Singapore is because of his sabbatical. Well-deserved sabbatical. He became provincial for the 2nd time. Then when he finished, he said, wrote an email and said, Derek, I want to come to Singapore for a 1-month sabbatical. I don't know why Singapore. Must be Jewel lah. Also, yes, actually when we flew back from Kuching, he hasn't seen the Jewel. I said, come, let's go and see the waterfall. Then he was like, wow, kind of thing. Yeah, so we did this talk in Kota Kinabalu first and then to Kuching from last Tuesday to Tuesday. So we just came back and then this is the 3rd time he's doing this series. Yes, okay, sabbatical. But before coming to Singapore, just 2 months before this, he was in Franciscan School of Theology. So in San Diego, we actually have a Franciscan School of Theology, and he was there teaching sacraments. Before that, he was 2 months in Lusaka in Zambia, right? And that's where we have got Conventuals, Capuchins, and OFM students, 200 of them, studying together. So all 3 branches of the first order studying together. So we hope that we are, I think, walking towards the road towards union. Let's see whether we can get over our differences and become brothers again, right? You know, brothers are sometimes got differences. Like how, it's not the fat, thin difference, okay? This is the, yes. So he has been teaching in St. Louis University, a Jesuit university, for 45 years. And what he's most proud of, during this time, he has directed 35 doctoral dissertations, and most of them on Franciscan themes. And he's still in contact with the students, and a lot of them are teaching already, and they continue to interact and just synergize and come up with more and more things. Tomorrow morning session, he's going to actually share on the latest research by his students on grace, and there's some Protestants among them. So actually, there's a lot of dialogue and all very exciting research happening in the Franciscan front. Okay, and he also said that about a third of Bonaventure's work have been translated into English. There's still a whole wealth of works still waiting to be translated. If it's not translated, theologians can't work on them, kind of a thing, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. So it's very exciting. So without further ado, let's invite Wayne and to deliver his talk on St. Francis and Pope Francis.
Well, I repeat a gratitude to all of you. Those of you who are getting a 2nd dose in the same day, that's a bit much. And those of you who are joining us this evening, so thank you. And I'm happy to be here somehow. Through my visits here, the Friars in Singapore have a place in my heart. So it's good to just come back to my heart, coming back here. Read, and I mean that sincerely with these guys. They're great. And also what I'm talking about, I almost feel embarrassed. For 45 years, I got a pretty decent salary from the university that, of course, went to the province and stuff. But I always felt guilty. How can you get paid for doing what you love? You know, it just seems so strange. I love doing this, and I would even pay to do what I'm doing, you know. So I'm happy to share with you because this is material I deeply love, and probably been my salvation, to be honest. I guess I decided when I was a young friar, there's got to be more to this than what I'm getting. And so I thought, I got to go diving somewhere. And then when I was a student in Rome, a professor introduced me to St. Bonaventure, and then that was it. I followed up on that. So thank you, because I'm happy to share this material, and I hope it's not too much. That's been my concern. But what I want to do this evening, since we're with my conversations with Friar Derek, it was to, when he asked me, well, he said, sure, you're welcome here, Wayne, but would you give us a few talks? And I said, well, sure, you know, whatever. What do you want? And something that we were thinking about, the first thing I thought was St. Francis and Pope Francis. Something that one of the themes I definitely wanted to speak about. Because Pope Francis basically has given the whole church a healthy dose of Franciscan spirituality. I'm not certain all Franciscans realize that. So that's why I'm happy to reflect on this. So what I'm going to do this evening, I'm going to kind of begin from the beginning of Pope Francis's pontificate when he called the Holy Year. The first thing he did. And his first message was about mercy. His very first message. And then, of course, we know, then he, shortly after that, produced his first encyclical, Joy of the Gospel. And I thought, mercy to gospel. I remember thinking, there's a plan here. When his first thing was on mercy, and then he moved straight into the gospel. And then from there was a plan. To Laudato Si, to Fratelli, Tutti. And I think those three texts are three pillars of Franciscan spirituality. And even the major superiors of the whole Franciscans family said in their 2020 letter they wrote together, especially about Fratelli Tutti, to read this text, can you imagine? To read this as though coming from Francis himself. Because what Pope Francis says in here is Francis's message. So we have some help. Lots of questions about Franciscan spirituality. Okay, sure. But by golly, now we got a path to go. Very clearly mapped out, almost systematically, that can help us understand more, embrace more of Franciscan charism. So I want to begin with his notion when he announced the mercy of God, as soon as he became Pope. What he was doing as well, in doing that, when Francis was doing, he was quoting John the 23rd. John the 23rd, at the very opening of the council, he announced, when he made the announcement, he says, and I'm quoting John the 23rd, now the bride of Christ wishes to use the medicine of mercy rather than taking up the arms of severity. The church is to hold high the torch of mercy. So what Pope Francis did is not new. He was building on what John the 23rd had done. And he would have known what John the 23rd said. So Francis then picks up, as he announces mercy, he says, the church is commissioned to announce the mercy of God. The medicine of mercy. Hold high that torch, Francis says, referring to that, the church is commissioned to announce the mercy of God, which is the beating heart of the gospel. God's mercy is the beating heart of the gospel. And he goes on, of course, the signs Jesus worked were especially in favor of sinners, the poor, marginalized, sick, and suffering. But all these signs are there to help us understand, embrace mercy. And that's how Pope Francis then began his ministry in the chair of St. Peter. And so it strikes me, how did Francis of Assisi begin his vocation? He tells us about that in his testament, where he writes, and I quote, "The Lord himself led me among them, among lepers, and I showed mercy to them. Facere misericordiam. I showed mercy to them." And it's from that showing of mercy his heart was liberated then to embrace the gospel, to hear the gospel. This is what I want. This is what I desire. So, interesting. St. Francis began the phase of his life, his conversion, not in a church praying before the crucifix. That comes later. That's a prayer of discernment. But the prayer basically of his conversion is to show mercy. And then Pope Francis begins his patrine ministry in service of the church in that same fashion. Facere misericordiam, to show mercy. I think it's important to note when we talk about those two, they're both connected in the foundation of gospel life, the beating heart of the gospel, mercy. We're going to look at now, based on that mercy, we want to look at these texts. But I want to explain this a little further. Mercy, Pope Francis writes, is the good life of the gospel. In Franciscans, Francis says the life of the Friar is the gospel. Well, the good life of the gospel is mercy. Mercy's at the heart of gospel living. And so Pope Francis picks that up. But when he picks it up, the gospel, mercy, he also joins that the gospel is founded on mercy, but the gospel sends us forth to make mercy, to do mercy. So Pope Francis puts a missionary thrust to understand the gospel. He asks, Pope Francis asks, who would claim to lock up in a church and silence the message of St. Francis of Assisi or Teresa of Calcutta? He says the gospel faith involves a deep desire to change the world, to transmit values, to leave this earth somehow better than we found it. In other words, what the Pope is saying, the gospel does not lock us up in a church, get out of the sacristy, but rather sends us into the world, sends us beyond ourselves. So a gospel life based on mercy is missionary in the thought of Pope Francis. And he makes that, he refers to St. Francis again. And this is the very beginning of his when he's talking about mercy. Notice what he refers to St. Francis again. He writes, small yet strong in the love of God, like St. Francis of Assisi, all of us as Christians are called to watch over and protect the fragile world in which we live and all its peoples. Can you believe that, what Francis is doing here? He's telling the whole church that all of us are called, what? To be like Francis. He's calling all the church should be Franciscan. Now that should be a bit of a support for us. No, if all the church is called to be Franciscan, and that's what Pope Francis is saying. Called to watch over, to protect the fragile world in which we live and all its peoples. So he says all Christians are called, like Francis of Assisi, all of us are to be like Francis of Assisi, called to do two things, to watch over and protect, one, the fragile world in which we live, and to watch over all its peoples. So this thrust of not being locked up in a church is to go out there, primarily in Francis's thinking, for two things, to watch over and protect the fragile world in which we live and all its peoples. I thought, there, something else is going on. And so what do we find? We have protect the fragile world, Laudato Si, watch over all its peoples, Fratelli Tutti. So There's a vision here. So I find it fascinating. Pope Francis telling the whole church that all are called to be like St. Francis. And you notice he doesn't say that about Jesuits. He says it about Franciscans. And so one would think Franciscans would get the message about gospel life, based on mercy, gospel life that is missionary, that's going forth and going out beyond ourselves. So, Christians called to be Franciscans means they're to get out of themselves, go beyond themselves as missionaries of the gospel. Two things: protect the fragile world and its peoples. So he's interpreting the gospel mission as twofold. But let's turn to St. Francis for a moment. Of course, for St. Francis, gospel is the foundation. The gospel is distributed throughout St. Francis's writings. And one notices, especially in his earlier writings about forming the Friars, he uses such phrases in his earlier writings. The Lord teaches us in the gospel. And then blah, blah, blah. And the Lord says in the gospel, admonition 3. It's interesting to note in the earlier rule, that is the first text of the Friars put together for their life, before there was a papal seal on a rule. It's interesting to note that Francis quotes the gospel 166 times within those texts. In the later rule, which is more a canonical rule, the gospel's referred to 14 times. Both rules, however, for the brothers begin in the early rule. He says the friars are to live to be of the gospel. Of the gospel. And of the gospel, and the later rule says to observe the gospel. But the point is, Franciscan life is described life of the gospel in the early rule, the later rule, to observe the holy gospel, life or to observe it. So the earlier rule develops out of the lived life of the brothers as they reflected deeply on the gospel. That's why they write their life is to be of the gospel, flow forth from praying the gospel, listening to the gospel, and entering into the gospel life. And it develops out of how they understood their life to be as brothers of the gospel. This is evangelical. The second one, as I mentioned, is a little more canonical with evangelical elements. In either case, what we have here in Francis's early writings about the life of the friars, it's revolutionary. Up to that time, in the history of the church, the model for any type of religious life was found in the Acts of the Apostles, where the disciples came together, the prayers, shared their goods, and took care of each other. That was the model that focused on the shared life of a community that gathers, where the disciples met and broke bread. And this description from Acts became the model especially for the development of monastic life. Okay? Monastic life. Which means a very careful structure. Francis chose another model to live a life of gospel, that is one that sends one out into the world to live and preach gospel. That's pretty radically different than entering into the monastic structure, which is stable, clear, and stability, vow of stability. Here, no, they go out. That was new. And it's not refers to Acts, but Francis simply refers to the gospel. And what becomes in the Franciscan hagiography and story is what, when Francis heard the gospel, the Portiuncula, his response, this is what I want, this is what I seek, this is what I desire with all my heart. That's the gospel he's talking about. The gospel is what I want. The gospel is what I seek. The gospel is what I desire with all my heart. So the gospel is our rule. Not a rule written by somebody else, but it's inspired by the Spirit, and it's of the message of Jesus. And so Franciscan spirituality is Franciscan gospel life rooted there. basically and fundamentally a gospel life, which is then with the beating heart of mercy and a missionary thrust to go out. So Francis then, this is what I want, this is what I desire, to reflect, to live, and to pray from within the Gospels as he moved from village to village, even beyond his European world to as far away as the Middle East. I think that's very significant when we think about the origins of the beginning of our Franciscan life. It's about gospel, folks. We ask, what's Franciscan spirituality? Well, start with the gospel. That's where you should start. And that makes very clear in Francis's writing and also in his own life. So we can find, as Francis is thinking, he puts a dynamic in his writings, word and deed. Bonaventure picks up on that too. In other words, Francis says, to do what Jesus did and to think what Jesus thought and reproduce in his life the Word made flesh. That is, reproduce the words and the deeds of the incarnate Word, as articulated in the early rule, teaching and footprints. And that's how most of Francis's writings actually develop, with an accent on the teaching of Christ, the words of Jesus, and the practical application of how they understood what they meant here and now in their context. The interplay, listening and doing, constant. And as it's based on the gospel with discernment, it changes. It changes because the context changes, which means Franciscan life based on the gospel allows a lot of fluidity that you will not find in monastic life. And so I'm thankful to God I'm not a monk, to be honest. Although I appreciate monastic life. I once did a retreat for monks, Trappist monks. I spent a week with them. My last conference, I told them, I said, brothers, it's time for me to leave. I'm beginning to like it here. So I want to come to this, which is an example of what I was talking about. The Lord teaches in the gospel. See? In the gospel, we got Luke, two passages from Luke and one from Matthew. The Lord teaches in the gospel. Watch, beware of all malice and greed. Guard yourselves against the anxieties of this world and the cares of this life. So, that's the word, that's the teaching. Guard yourselves against the anxieties of this world, being all caught up in the cares of this life. And then he adds to these itinerant brothers the deed. Okay, guys, that's what the gospel teaches. Here's how we apply that. Let none of the brothers, therefore, wherever he may be or go, carry, receive in any way coin or money, indeed not for any reason, unless for evident need of the sick brothers. Mercy, okay? So, what we have here is a word and a deed. And that's how they understood those texts in the context of their fraternal life. That means guarding yourselves against the anxieties of this world. You don't take all kinds of luggage with you when you go. You just go. And that's going and trusting in God. To not be burdened, therefore, with money that was emerging in that Italian medieval society at that time, which was causing a lot of tension. So that's how they understood. They got to guard themselves against the anxieties of the world by not getting caught up in that. So it's an example of where we have the word and the deed. So concrete deeds in Francis's thinking, discernment of the teaching of the Word of God as discovered in contemplation, based, of course, on concrete specific reality. And only in our words and in our deeds can we be of the gospel. To be of the gospel. That our words and our deeds are basically gospel message, good news, not bitter news. Turn to Pope Francis. In the beginning of his encyclical Joy of the Gospel, he alludes to this same dynamic. In the very beginning, he talks about the word and the deed of the gospel. And that's coming from St. Francis. He doesn't quote him at that point, but he's coming in implementing that same dynamic that Francis and the brothers came up with, because that earlier rule was written by the whole fraternity together. So it's almost as though Pope took it straight from the earlier rule. And that has implications that our vocation is to continue the incarnation of the Word and put that Word in flesh, concrete reality. To take that Word, but put it in flesh. So when we look at Francis's writings about our gospel life, it's dynamic. As friars developed their life of gospel together, and they lived in those early years of the fraternity, according as the Spirit inspired them to hear the gospel, to apply it. But as they go forward developing their gospel life, Francis makes very explicit what is required. I'm here talking Pope Francis. Show ourselves joyful, cheerfully, consistently gracious in the Lord. Show the joy of the gospel. And so as the gospel life is to be lived, Francis says, yes, but that's how we show ourselves joyful, cheerful, consistently gracious in the Lord. I like that. Consistently gracious in the Lord. That's how we demonstrate joy of the gospel. I don't know if Francis got the title of his encyclical from that or not, but it's certainly in Francis's writing supporting gospel life in Francis's vision is indeed joyful, cheerful, gracious, or it is not gospel. Sourpusses don't announce the gospel. Neither do grumpy old friars. So last summer at St. Bonaventure University in the US, we had a conference targeting younger friars across the First Order. It was a First Order conference. More and more we're doing First Order things. Praise God for that. And in that First Order conference of friars, it was wonderful. There were about 100 friars there, and we all had breakout sessions, and the friars were giving papers. But one of the main speakers was Bishop Corvo, who was the former Minister General of the Capuchins. And he said something that startled me. Then I had to think about it. And he tells us, I'm quoting somewhat loosely here, he says, Franciscans are not to follow rules. Rather, for Franciscans, rules follow the friars. Why? If we're discerning, listening to the gospel and what the Lord has said to us, we've heard this in the gospel, discern this is what it means. That's our rule coming from the gospel. And if we write it down, it's following us as we go forward. It's a way to look back. It's a way to look back, our rules, not to look ahead. To look ahead, the gospel. And I thought, I wish I would have heard this 30, 40 years ago. Because when my formation, man, we had rules. So I thought, John Corvo, an incredible, wonderful human being, really had some insights for us that he shared. That our life is not static, because if it's the Spirit continuing to inspire us to hear and understand, apply the gospel message to concrete reality, our life continues to develop constantly new. We can't be stuck. Because the gospel is dynamic, and the Spirit that helps us hear those words, the Spirit that helps us discern and apply that, is dynamic. So I kind of tell some young people, if you're not open to change, you better go to the monastery. Don't join us. Quite frankly, So in both St. Francis and Pope Francis, I'm trying to emphasize what they emphasize. Gospel is mission. And Pope Francis constantly shows how God challenges those who believe in him to go forth. He writes, Abraham received a call to set out for a new land. Moses heard God's call, go, I send you. Jeremiah heard God's call, to whom I send you, you shall go. And Jesus in our own day, and most recently in these days, go and make disciples. Go out there. So Pope Francis concludes, all of us are called in the example of Francis to take part in the missionary life of going forth. We are all listening to the gospel. We're not hearing the gospel if we stay wrapped up in ourselves. The gospel sends us forth, a new missionary going forth. And of course, that's his dream for the whole church, that we would start getting out there more. But we're asked to go forth. Basically, that means our comfort zone, if nothing else. And he says to reach all the peripheries in the light of the gospel. And about this new missionary going forth, Francis, we already said, has something to say. Let them take nothing for their journey. Think about this. Francis has more than just a few words about being sent. The primary message for Francis as we are sent to go forth is whatever house you enter, peace to this house. So the basic gospel message of going forth, based on mercy, is about what? Peace. And that's all connected. From mercy through the gospel to the very message is peace. And Pope Francis says exactly the same thing. He writes, the gospel message always begins with the greeting of peace. That's exactly what St. Francis said in terms of identifying the mission of being sent forth. So those two are really on the same page when it comes to a vision of gospel mission. And then the Pope, in his Joy to the Gospel, asks the question. He asks, to whom does one go forth? You got to go. He's saying that over and over. You got to go forth. To whom do you go? It's a very quick response he gives. Go forth first to the poor and the sick. The purpose of our mission is first and foremost to the poor and the sick, those overlooked, and above all, those who cannot repay you. That's what Pope Francis writes. Go first. Where do you go? First to the poor and the sick, those overlooked, and above all, those who cannot repay you. And of course, Pope Francis would say, you go forth to the poor and the sick, overlooked, and above all, those who can't repay you, both near and far. Near and far. There are lots of places we need to go. And those same words, it's fascinating, those same words are almost the same words of St. Francis. Francis writes, the brothers must rejoice when they live among people considered of little value, looked down upon, among the poor and the powerless. The poor and the powerless who cannot repay you. They're both giving us the same message. Francis in his writings, especially in that earlier rule, and Pope Francis in Joy of the Gospel. I think one helps understand the other. Pope Francis can help us understand, St. Francis, that our gospel life that we profess, all of us, Francis, can profess the gospel life that is missionary. Franciscan life is missionary. And you know, I have to give Pope Francis credit. He's working his butt off, really, trying hard to arouse the church from its slumber, to wake up to our missionary vocation. I couldn't believe it. It was this is spring, I guess it was last fall. He spent a week in the Canadian Arctic with Native Americans who are looked down upon, forgotten, and marginalized. He goes and spends a whole week there. That's a lot of people time, a whole week. What? Basically to seek their forgiveness for the way that we Europeans basically have abused them. And then there in Congo, since I was just in Zambia, it was like staggering because it affected people all over the mid-Africa. His visit to Congo recently, when he went to Congo, 1 million people at Mass. Have you ever been to a Mass with 1 million people? One Mass for 1 million people? And they pulled it off. Pretty missionary right there. And incredible support to all those people in the Congo who are suffering from politicians who can't get along. So, and this Holy Thursday this week, it was interesting. He went back to the same prison he went 10 years ago. And again, washed the feet of Christians and Muslims together in the Holy Thursday. That's mission. He's getting out there. Not only the place where he went, but what he does when he gets there. Goes beyond. So when I hear these questions, Franciscan Spirituality, pick up the Gospel and look at the deeds of Pope Francis. You get a clue what that's involved. There's just one more point I want to make about mission. It's cut because both St. Francis and Pope Francis bring it up. Preaching. Pope Francis talks about preaching. And St. Francis does too. Almost in the same dimensions. I love to tease my Dominican friends that they're not the order of preachers, the Franciscans are. Because in their rules, the rule of St. Augustine, there's not a word about preaching, yet they call themselves the order of preachers in the foundation of the rule. I say, ding dong, guys, I don't get it, But the Franciscans, we got pretty clear directions how important preaching is in our basic fundamental writings of St. Francis, So Francis does, as he's speaking in the context of mission, wherever they go, basically, notice what he says. Let no brother preach contrary to the rite and practice of the church, or without the permission of his minister. That's too important of a position. One, it has to be in the context of the rite and practice of the church. And you got to have permission of your minister, who has to discern if this person is ready or qualified or capable of preaching well. It's not just preaching, it's preaching well. Wow. So we can find that Francis sees that as very important, and he puts peripheries there on it. It's not going out and spouting off my own philosophies about whatever. It's got to be in the context of the rite and practice of the church, which means the gospel, which means the cross we talked about this morning. So it continues that, and let the minister be careful of granting it without discernment. That's a serious decision. So it's not when you finish your studies, boom, you get a free pass to the pulpit. No, it shouldn't be that way. Maybe it is, but it shouldn't be that way. That should be carefully discerned. But then he adds, that's one form of preaching, and this is the context maybe, because the friars were preachers, but they weren't liturgical preachers necessarily until later. And let all the brothers, however, preach by their deeds, which all are called by our deeds, word and deed, to preach. So all the brothers are to preach by their deeds. That formal preaching in the name of the church has to be discerned. And then notice this next line. No minister or preacher may make a ministry of the brothers or the office of preaching his own. In other words, none of the brothers have a right to go out there and preach. None of them have a right to be the minister. That is all temporary assignment. It's not a right that one can own, which means you have to be ready to let it go at any moment, which is not always easy. Let it go at whatever moment. So this is what basically just an example of what Francis is saying about preaching. But he's very consistent in other writings. We cannot own our ministry, because our preaching is not about the preacher. It's focused on the Word of God. And liturgical preaching has got to be ecclesial, because liturgical preaching, especially in the Eucharist, it's part of the liturgy. It's not time for my sermon, folks. No, it's a moment within the development of the liturgical structure itself. And which means, Pope Francis says, more than 10 minutes, you're a failure. Why? Because you're taking more time out of the liturgy than you should. It interrupts the flow of the movement of the liturgical rite itself in terms of from passing from the Word to the Eucharist. It's to conclude the liturgy of the Word. So there too, when Pope Francis talks about preaching, he says it's not your personal agenda. That doesn't belong there. And it's not about your ski vacation. It doesn't belong there. So Both Pope Francis and St. Francis, in different kinds of languages, are on the same page about the carefulness of one who preaches and the seriousness of it being reviewed, basically. I did a convocation for a diocesan priest in the Diocese of Las Cruces, New Mexico, this is spring, it was last fall. I keep thinking what time of year it is because this weather confuses me, you know. So, and the bishop wouldn't give me any clue. He said, we just want you to come and talk to us for 2 days. So give me a clue. What do you need? What do you want? He says, just come, trust the Spirit. Okay. So I thought, the clergy in the diocese are mostly from abroad. There are very few. From Mexico, from Nigeria, from India, in other words, not having grown up in the Southwest, which is a unique culture in the United States. And so I thought, what do I do with them? What would help both serve them? So I picked up on Pope Benedict's text after the Synod on the Word of God. It's called Verbum Domini, which is a very beautiful, important text. And it's on the Word of the Lord. And I wanted to start with Benedict. I thought it'd be safer there with those guys. And then move into Francis. So we were talking somehow about this, and can you believe it? And the bishop's sitting right there in the front seat. And I was talking about the responsibility in preaching, which you need to have feedback, you need to get pushback, you need to be evaluated, you need to get some, because it's not a personal thing, it's a matter of the liturgy, which is a part of the assembly of the people of God, for God's sake, So I was telling those guys, I started asking, do you have anyone who evaluates your preaching and gives you feedback? Duh, who ever heard of that? And I said to them, that's so important, and it's not about you, and it's the people of God need to have a voice in this as well. And I'm coming from my experience in the university preaching, where I had to have a whole corps of students helping me prepare, evaluating me, et cetera, So I felt comfortable pushing that. And so I said to Bishop, your preaching needs to be evaluated as well, And I said, I'd like to make the suggestion, next, when you preach, be sure it's streamed, and you guys watch and give him some feedback. Is that okay, Bishop? He goes, yeah, I guess so, yeah. But the point is, both Francis and I just underline this because I think preaching gets abused. They're on the same point. There's also, let's go to the next one. There's also, Pope Francis talks about preaching. Francis talks about official preaching and the popular preaching of the brothers by their deeds. Now, Pope talks about the same thing. Missionary renewal brings gospel to those we meet. And he says, this informal preaching, which takes place in the middle of conversation, something along the lines of what a missionary does when visiting home. And the first step in this informal preaching is personal dialogue. That's where informal preaching begins, just in personal dialogue and conversation. In personal dialogue, only afterwards is it possible to bring up God's word. So Pope Francis is really strong. Preaching begins in dialogue, in personal dialogue. And that's for all of us. Because we all end up in conversations. We all have connections. And that's where preaching begins, in personal dialogue. And when he talks about this path of dialogue, but he concludes, he says, Pope Francis, any preaching must point to a horizon of beauty. Missionary style of preaching concentrates on essentials, on what's most beautiful, most grand, the beauty, the saving love of God. It cannot be focused on complicated doctrines that no one understands. He's pretty blunt there. It can't be constant in preaching. There's place for that, but not in preaching, to go into deeper theological kinds of questions. And Pope Francis, again, says the same thing. Listen, I quote, "I admonish and exhort those brothers that when they preach, their language be well considered and chaste, for the benefit and the edification of people." I admonish and exhort those brothers when they preach, their language be well considered and chaste, for the edification and encouragement of people. So let's recap a minute and I conclude this joy of the gospel. We've seen that the notion of mercy is basic to St. Francis and Pope Francis, showing mercy to lepers. That opened Francis' ears to hear the gospel. This is what I want. So it's from mercy to hear the gospel. And we saw the same dynamic with Pope Francis. Shortly on his letter on mercy, to announce the year of mercy, he is moved to his apostolic exhortation on the joy of mercy. Yes, from mercy to gospel, a consistency. And I conclude this section what I said at the beginning. Missionary vocation based on gospel, Franciscan life. That means we are all called to get out of ourselves, go beyond ourselves. And as missionaries of gospel, we're called to do two things: protect the fragile world in which we live, protect all its peoples. And Pope Francis, in this text on joy of the gospel, he's sowing the seeds of what he follows up on in Laudato Si, Fratelli, Tutti. And we'll move forward into those two encyclicals of Pope Francis because he stays on track. Before I do those two, I want to take a break for a few minutes, stand up before you fall asleep and fall on the floor. Okay, stand up, everybody, stand up. Let's take a break.